Good morning. As soon as everyone gets seated, we'll get started. And thank you for coming. My name is Bill Shepard. I'm the Vice President of the Abraham Lincoln Association, and helped, along with many other people, organize this today. So it's a beautiful day at Cantigny, and hope you get a chance to see some of the grounds here and some of the other attractions, because it's quite a place. And but we're here because of Joseph Medill and, of course, Colonel McCormick. This is their ancestral home, and hence I think it's appropriate that we have someone who has worked here for a number of years and very familiar with the property talk in a few moments, Will Uhlig. And but first, let me just kind of give you an idea about the Abraham Lincoln Association. It's I think there are a number of members here from the ALA. Could you raise your hands? Thank you. That's fantastic. So this is our first foray in recent years outside of Springfield. So obviously this is success. We'll continue doing these kind of things. But part of our mission is to bring Mr. Lincoln to the people. That was our mission when we began in 1909, when a banquet was held in Springfield on the 100th anniversary of Abraham Lincoln's birthday. And this organization has existed and thrived ever since then. And it's because of members like you who continue to support the ALA that we can continue doing these type of things, and also publish our Journal of the Abraham Lincoln Association twice a year, which is the leading and perhaps the only scholarly journal of its type that talks about Abraham Lincoln and his times. We also have 4 newsletters per year, which also has other information of that nature, and articles written by Michael Burlingame and a variety of other people. And so that's what we do, but we know that we need to get outside the confines of Central Illinois and come here and other places in the future. So once again, thank you for coming. And we were very excited about the turnout, and because every sheet may eventually be filled this morning as more people show up for this during the course of the day. This is a very tight schedule, and I apologize for that in advance, because that's my doing. And so, but we will try to build in a break or two in the morning and afternoon. I know that you'll have to get up and stretch your legs and perhaps attend to other business during the course of the day and not just sit here all day. So very mindful of that. There is a lunch break, and Birdie's Cafe is around the corner. I visited here 2 weeks ago and talked to Brandon, the gentleman who runs that, and warned him that we will be here and there may be a lot of hungry Abraham Lincoln devotees here, so around the lunch hour, so hope that they will be prepared for that. So, but I'm going to hand this over to Will Uhlig, who is the in charge of the First Division Museum as the operations and the archives. I went over there last 2 weeks ago. It's a fantastic place. You really need to see this at some point, if not today. So, and just go down the way and turn left at the Abrams tank is how you get there. So, thank you.
That's the brown thing.
Oh, yes. We're recording this, by the way, so we have to do the handoff for the mic for every speaker, so that's what we're doing here. So, and we're going to put this on our website eventually once it gets edited, so we can get this to all the other Lincoln devotees. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Welcome everyone to Cantigny. Get myself wired up here. I wasn't aware this is your first trip for this group outside Springfield. So wow,
in
recent years. Okay, that's that. I've been living in this area for about 20 years, but I grew up near Jacksonville, Illinois, and growing up, especially even closer to Beardstown. So heard about Lincoln very frequently. Class trips, field trips to Springfield, and I've been to Lincoln Home so many times I've forgotten how many times I've been there. Of course, the Lincoln Museum. My parents still live downstate, so every time I go downstate, I hit the Lincoln Museum. So my family rolls their eyes at me. So on behalf of the McCormick Foundation, Board of Directors, CEO Tim Knight, welcome to Cantigny. For those of you who aren't familiar with Cantigny, it's approximately 520 acres. As Bill mentioned, it was the home of Joseph Medill, And when Mr. Medill died in 1899, his grandson lived here and eventually bought it for $1 from his mother. And this became his suburban estate. Robert R. McCormick, as I'm sure you're all aware, was the editor, publisher, and owner of Tribune Company from 1911 to 1955. Chicago Tribune, WGN Radio and Television, a couple of newspapers on the East Coast. But he had a nice house on Astor Street, Chicago. But I don't know if you noticed when you came in, when you parked in the parking lot, that was this area, that's now the parking lot, was Mr. McCormick's airstrip. And if he didn't want to drive in to the city via Route 38, Roosevelt Road, he could fly. And he would fly from Cantigny to what's now Norley Island, or back then Meigs Field. 15-minute commute, he could be walking to the front door of Tribune Tower. So Mr. McCormick loved bringing people here. He was the man in the tower in the city. This allowed him to come to relax, escape that. It also was a place where he could show off, and a close group of friends came here occasionally. When Tribune had anniversaries to celebrate, it was here at Cantigny that Robert would do that. Joseph Medill was Robert McCormick's maternal grandfather. And I don't want to steal too much of Jeff's thunder, but Joseph Medill moved here to the Chicago area from Cleveland in 1855 and took control of a struggling newspaper called the Chicago Tribune. And within about 5 years, by the time of the Civil War started, the Tribune was, I think Jeff will agree with me, perhaps the most powerful newspaper in the Midwest, or the West at the time. And Joseph Medill was always very proud of his support of Abraham Lincoln, which, and again, Jeff will tell you about this, but it goes back to the Lincoln-Douglas debates. The Tribune was the only newspaper at the time that had a reporter there following Lincoln at every stop. So that link between Medill and Lincoln was pretty strong. We've got a couple of artifacts of Lincoln's in our home, McCormick House. So that link is pretty strong, and I think this is a very natural place to have a gathering of folks like us today. But a little bit more about Cantigny. Again, 520 acres. Robert McCormick died in 1955. He was 74. And despite being married twice, he had no children, which was bad for him but good for us. In that, in 1955, he had a personal fortune of around $50 million. And he takes that fortune and starts a nonprofit, back then called the McCormick Trust, now called the McCormick Foundation. And he gave his board of directors some pretty broad guidelines. But essentially, the foundation does two things right now, per Mr. McCormick's wishes. Number one, it's the philanthropy side of our mission. And it's stationed downtown. Until recently, it was in Tribune Tower, but now it's just a couple blocks south. That part serves Mr. McCormick's obligation to the city he loves, Chicago. And currently, the foundation is giving out tens of millions of dollars each year to various programs throughout the city. But here at Cantigny, Mr. McCormick also wanted to convert his private property, his estate here in Wheaton, to a public park. And we've been doing that since 1958 is when we opened. And part of that is the house. Part of that in 1960 was the first Division Museum, as Bill mentioned. The reason why we have this funny name, Cantigny, was because of Mr. McCormick's military service. Now, one of my favorite stories about Robert McCormick was the fact that when World War I started, Robert McCormick also was the man in charge of Tribune Company. Very powerful man, very wealthy man, but he gave all that up to serve in the regular army under John Pershing in the 1st Infantry Division. He served with the 5th Artillery, 1st Infantry Division, the battle called Battle of Cantigny, a small town north of Paris. Now, even though Mr. McCormick he had the Spanish flu, he got that right before the battle. Legend has it he was directing his troops through on his cot. Say, go do this. So, and within about 35 minutes, the American army routed the Germans out of Cantigny and successfully repelled 7 counterattacks. Robert came back to the United States after the war and called this place Cantigny for that military battle. So, but again, going back in time, like throughout his time in Tribune Company, Robert always referred to Lincoln. We know his office at Tribune Tower had several Lincoln statues, which you still have here at the house. So, again, I'm thrilled that you're here today. Thank you, Bill, for allowing me to speak today. The park itself is open to the public. We have gardens, we have a museum, we have all these cool things happening throughout the estate. We just finished something called Project New Leaf, which was an investment of about $25 million. Just in the gardens, overall $60 million invested into the park. So if you haven't been here lately, please take a walk. You'll go see some new stuff that's pretty great. So with that, I will conclude, and I will want to introduce to you someone I know pretty well. Jeff Anderson and I worked together at the McCormick House for 16 years. Jeff is now the director of the Glen Ellen Historical Society, so I haven't seen him in a couple of weeks, so it's good to see him again. So with that, Jeff Anderson, come on up. Should I do this carefully? Thank you, folks.
Thank you.
Not as tall as he is. Hold on. Okay, everybody. First off, thank you very much for having me out. I love talking about my historical bromance, Joseph Medill. Northwestern gave this to me when I wrote a biography about him for them, so I figured I'd bring him with me today. I get asked all the time if I'm a Lincoln historian. I am not, so all of you, I think, might be. I'm a Medill historian. I love talking about Joseph Medill. You can't talk about Joseph Medill and his rise to power without talking about Abraham Lincoln. Very simply, I like to tell people that Abraham Lincoln owed his presidential election mainly to one thing, and that was newspapers, because you didn't have other options. You didn't have internet, television, radio, so if you want to know what Lincoln was saying, you showed up and you read it in the paper. 2, the most influential newspaper on Abraham Lincoln's presidential election is pretty inarguably the Chicago Tribune. And 3, the person who ran the Chicago Tribune was Joseph Medill. So I love saying that Joseph Medill was very influential on Abraham Lincoln's presidential election. And you don't have to believe me. I'm actually going to show you this in my PowerPoint today. I made this PowerPoint about a decade ago when I heard rumor that there was a ring that Joseph Medill was given as from Abraham Lincoln. And then when Lincoln, after the funeral train came through, one of the pallbearers, he gave that ring that Lincoln gave him to the pallbearer, and then that ring eventually made its way to a historical society, and then I got word that it was at a museum. So I was like, hey, do you guys have this ring? I'd love to know about it, get some pictures. And I got an email back saying, and I'm not going to throw names under the bus, but it's like, we don't like Joseph Medill. We don't like to talk about him. We respect anything he has to say. And I was like, wow. Do you have the ring? And they're like, yeah, we have the ring. Here's some pictures. I was like, thank you very much. So I visited the Lincoln Museum the next year and walked around. I just, a few years before, had done I think a $270 million renovation of the entire place. It was amazing. And not a single mention of the Chicago Tribune. So I was like, wow, that's strange. So I talked to a couple people and they're like, oh, well, we don't want to call out any specific newspapers. I'm like, that's fine. So I went back and I made this lecture. And I went back the next year at the Illinois History Conference and I gave it to everybody there, expecting them to get all angry at me. And they listened and then they walked out without saying anything to me. So I decided when I was asked to speak about Lincoln and Joseph Medill, I'd dust off this one, updated some slides, and I'm going to try to give it to you in about 25 minutes. So let's get started. Really, the Chicago Tribune is a newspaper that was founded in 1847. Not by Joseph Medill. It was founded by another group of 4 men. And, acknowledgments. A lot of documents. I really wanted to make sure that I was using straight up documents. So if people are like, that's not true, you can argue with the document, not me. So these are where a lot of these documents come from. These are the men who really were influential early on at the Chicago Tribune. So that's Joseph Medill. Whoa. Hey, Dominic, what happened? I didn't do it. I was thinking the same thing. Somebody in here is blocking me now. I don't need it. I did a 3-hour class on Cantigny for the College of DuPage, so if you really want a long talk, I'll give you one, but I like slides. Oh, well, so you saw the pictures. So there's two gentlemen in that slide, because I want to keep to my time. The handsome man, the young man, that's Joseph Medill. It's a photograph of Joseph Medill when he was about 1855, when he first came to Chicago. So I always say he was a handsome young man. At one point they said the Medills, there was another newspaper said the Medills were some of the most handsome single bachelors in Chicago. Medill was married, so he was not bachelor, but he was a pretty decent looking guy. Then there's an image next to him of a gentleman a little older with a big beard, and that was his partner, a gentleman named Dr. Charles Ray. So real quick backstory, Joseph Medill was a farmer who decided to become a lawyer, didn't really succeed well at that, so his papers in Ohio. Then he decided he would get involved in politics, and he became a member of the Whig Party, and they called him a liberal Whig. So he really hated slavery, and that was a big thing he latched onto. When he was there, he met people such as Horace Greely, a bunch of other powerful people in Cleveland. He decided he was going to create a newspaper in a place called Coshocton, Ohio. And he created a newspaper, and he ran it for a couple of years, brought his brothers in to run it, and he decided that he was successful because Coshocton became a Whig county, and he was really proud of himself. And he's like, if I can do this in Coshocton, I can do this somewhere else. So he goes to Cleveland, and he starts up another newspaper. Eventually, that newspaper becomes the Cleveland Leader. That's important because the Cleveland Leader became one of the largest newspapers in Cleveland, which at the time, in the 1840s, Cleveland was the 7th largest city in the United States. So he starts becoming a very successful newspaper publisher. And he decided that when the Whig Party decided to change direction and not kind of push against slavery, he was one of the people that led the call to create a new political organization. And he's also credited by many historians in their books as the person who comes up with the term the Republican Party for that new party. So Joseph Medill is considered a founding member of the Republican Party, has a big meeting, all these gentlemen come by, they decide they're going to forego their political alliances, and they're going to form this anti-slavery party. So that's Joseph Medill in the very early years of his newspaper career. The other gentleman, that's Dr. Charles Ray. Dr. Charles Ray was an anti-slavery Democrat from Galena. He ran a newspaper called the Galena Jeffersonian, and at the suggestion of Horace Greely, who both of them knew, he said, hey, you both want to do something? Go west, young man. He said that to everybody, I guess. So they go to Chicago and they meet up at Horace Greeley's suggestion, and Medill, who was great at running a newspaper, decided he knew of a newspaper, he had been there the year before, called the Chicago Tribune, that was not doing very well. And Ray wanted to create a new newspaper. He's like, it's more cost effective if we take over the Tribune. So they come together, they buy controlling interest in the Chicago Tribune in 1855, early 1855. When they take over the newspaper, it's not doing very well. It's only got a circulation of, I think, 1,500 at the time. In a short period of time, they managed to double the entire circulation of the Tribune. So within a matter of months, because they turn it from a know-nothing newspaper at the time to a pro-Republican anti-slavery newspaper, they found a very strong audience in Chicago. So really quickly, it doubles in circulation. So he starts doing pretty well early on. And then this really tall guy walks in, Abraham Lincoln. He decides to buy a newspaper subscription, and that's where they first meet. So this is where they first meet Abraham Lincoln in Chicago at the Tribune. Chicago was also starting to get bigger, 85,000, not too bad in 1855. Then they decide Chicago doesn't have a Republican Party yet. It's still blooming. They just formed like the year before. So they said, we need to have a convention. So a bunch of newspaper publishers get together, and one non-newspaper publisher shows up. That's Abraham Lincoln. They all gather, and they decide, we're going to hold a convention. We're going to establish a Republican Party in Illinois. So they decide they're going to have a convention in Bloomington. So they have the convention in Bloomington. Different delegates are sent. Joseph Medill and Abraham Lincoln are there. And of course, there's a bunch of people who come up and speak. Lincoln supposedly gives this really, really fiery speech. Most people refer to it as the law speech. There's a lot of documents related to this, and later on, Ida Tarbell, back with Joseph Medill, because he was one of the last people who actually had heard him speak in the 1890s. But all Medill really said in that is that it was very, very emotional. It was a very anti-slavery speech. He said it was so moving that none of the reporters that were there remembered to write it down. That's how moved these people were. And I always argue it's really likely because if you look at the people who were members of the early Republican Party, these were all hardcore anti-slavery men. Some of them abolitionists, but they were all coming together for one main cause, and that was to end slavery. So Lincoln's Law speech, now the Republican Party is being formed in Illinois, so that's that convention. Oh, this is from the 1960s. I just love the idea of Lincoln getting up and getting all fiery and motivating these anti-slavery men. The Chicago Tribune starts expanding. Supposedly their newspaper circulation started dipping, and they decided they were going to merge with another newspaper in Chicago, and they do so, and the newspaper kind of changes its name. It becomes the Chicago Press and Tribune in early 1858. And then these two gentlemen come on board. We got Lieutenant Governor William Bross. You don't want to run into that guy walking out of the woods. He looks very scary. And then you have another fairly famous man, John Locke Scripps, and you'll hear his name later on. But these men come together, and these are the driving force of the Chicago Tribune in 1858. Really important for Lincoln because now we get to the Lincoln-Douglas debates. So the Chicago Tribune didn't just report about what Lincoln was doing. They were doing everything they could to help him become the next senator. And to give you an idea, the Chicago Times, which was a very pro-Douglas newspaper, and is connected to a person that I'll mention in a bit that Joseph Medill didn't like very much, started saying nasty things about him, which is pretty commonplace in newspapers. But it was the Chicago Tribune editors who started writing Lincoln about what was being said about him. So this is a letter that they write to him basically saying that the Times is saying that you voted against supporting financially the troops. And now this letter didn't just automatically get there. They had to pay somebody to take it all the way to Springfield, so it might have taken a bit. But to show you how quickly it got there, Lincoln writes right back. So the letter gets there, Lincoln's like, oh, this isn't good. So Lincoln decides to give them, and he's a very intelligent individual. He knew exactly, he's like, I wasn't even in Congress at that time. He's like, I didn't come in until this date. He's like, here's exactly where the records are. Here's the name of the person who voted that way. It wasn't me. It's a long letter basically clearing his name. Gets back to the Chicago Tribune. Next day, appears in the Chicago Tribune, basically clearing Lincoln's name. So they're working behind the scenes, helping Lincoln out against all these attacks, especially from the Chicago Times, the newspaper that really didn't like him that much. Then we got Horace Greely. Love Horace Greely. Horace Greely wasn't a huge fan of Abraham Lincoln. He wanted other people to become senator at that time. And Joseph Medill and Ray both knew him pretty well. And he writes Joseph Medill this letter. So this is a letter from Horace Greely to Joseph Medill. And in the letter, he basically calls, he's like, you know what we wanted. And you pushed him out. And what he's talking about is Douglas sent feelers to the Chicago Tribune and other newspapers to see, hey, can Douglas become a Republican? Now, some historians say this might not have happened. Well, somebody went and talked to these people in Douglas's name because this letter is basically saying, you, Joseph Medill, pushed Douglas out. You know what we wanted on the East Coast. We could have used him. He would have been a great support in the next presidential election. And it's like, and you decided to go with Abraham Lincoln, basically. And he's not happy about this. Now, Joseph Medill's version of this letter burnt up in the Great Chicago Fire. Most of Medill's letters burned that way. I'm very lucky that Joseph Medill decided he wanted Abraham Lincoln to know what Greely was saying about him. So he sends him this letter. This is actually Abraham Lincoln's handwriting because he wrote the letter down, kept it in his files, and then he sent Medill back his original, and that one burnt up. So this is at the Library of Congress. It's a great letter. It also shows, yes, there was some feelers trying to see if Douglas could jump ship. Oh, Horace Greely. I always call him Neckbeard Greely. Love Greely. Okay, Joseph Medill to Abraham Lincoln. So in support of Abraham Lincoln, Lincoln was not very wealthy at this point. So unlike Douglas, who had newspapers sending reporters around with him, Abraham Lincoln didn't have that support. Except he did through the Chicago Tribune. And there's a letter to Lincoln saying, hey, we're sending you this person. I think he calls him Davison. He ends up getting the name wrong. He says, we're sending Davison to go with you, travel with you, to write down what you're saying, your speeches, later on your debates, and we're going to publish them in the Chicago Tribune. So yes, this person is with us. It's not Davison he sent, it's actually this gentleman, Horace Greely, who will go on to have a very fascinating publishing career, for good or bad for the Chicago Tribune, but he became a driving force in the Tribune later on in life. So this is just him showing that the Chicago Tribune was financially invested in supporting Abraham Lincoln. Cyrus McCormick. So for those who aren't familiar with the McCormick family in Cantigny Park, McCormick is related to really two powerful families. We got Joseph Medill in the Chicago Tribune, and I'll go back to that in a second. And then we have his father's side of the family, and that's Cyrus McCormick and the Reaper family. If you want to go learn more about that, you don't have to go far. Right next door, you have St. James Farms. Go back to St. James, because that's where you get Reaper money. That's not where this fortune comes from. This is the Medill family. I bring them up because these men hated each other. You got a hardcore supporter of Stephen Douglas and Cyrus McCormick, and you got the Medill Tribune backing Abraham Lincoln. Eventually, they would be united through marriage. That must have been fun at family dinners. So just to give you an idea, Cyrus McCormick did own newspapers, and he bought these newspapers to support his political allies, mainly Stephen Douglas. So he ends up running both the Herald and the Times. Okay, so I love this photograph, and I'm sure most of you have probably seen this before. So this is a photograph that the Chicago Tribune was spreading out, so people, when they were trying to show people what Abraham looked like when he was running. And there's an article in it where they talk about this letter, and they basically say, we got this great letter, we're showing it out, but there's a newspaper called The Journal who's unhappy with us because we caught Abraham Lincoln while he's holding the Chicago Tribune, and they thought it was unfair. At the bottom of it, you might, if you can read quickly, it basically says, it would be even more, the likeness of, hold on. Oh, it would be a curiosity to catch a man of sensibility reading their newspaper. So basically, they're putting down their competing newspaper. I love this photograph because it's fake. This is not Abraham Lincoln holding the Chicago Tribune. This photograph was taken years before, and he's holding a German newspaper. I don't know how you Photoshop in the 1850s, but I love the fact, but it makes sense because the Chicago Tribune is financially invested in Abraham Lincoln. It would make sense that they're not going to show him holding another newspaper. They want to show that Abraham Lincoln is all about the Chicago Tribune. So that's the whole purpose of the photograph. Yeah, Zatz, I can't speak German. Zatz, it's a German newspaper, yeah. There you go, that one. Okay, so this is a letter from Lincoln to Ray, again, Medill's partner, and he basically says, I want to preserve copies of my debate with Douglas, and I want to preserve it, and at the end of the letter, that's what I really love. He basically tries cheering up the Chicago Tribune. He just lost his senatorial race, and he's trying to cheer up the Tribune, which is awesome to me. And he doesn't swear very often, and he kind of wrote hell and crashed it off. So this is just basically him saying, hey, I want to have something. But the reason he wanted to preserve these newspapers is because he wanted to publish his first book. So you can go to Library of Congress. They have the entire thing scanned. It's amazing. Lincoln's first book is basically cut out copies of his debates from the Chicago Tribune, and then he went to the Chicago Times, the Douglas newspaper, and he cut out Douglas's side of it. And he took those, slapped them in a book, and that's what he took and had published. So this is fantastic, and if you ever go through it, it's great because it's got Lincoln's own handwriting in the original manuscript where he's making notes where they got something wrong, but most of it's pretty accurate. So this is Lincoln's first book. Now, I love this. This is a letter that they were sending out to different counties to try to get people to basically sell circulations of the Chicago Tribune. And I call it Selling Lincoln because in this, he says, we are the true Lincoln newspaper. Basically, they were saying, we just went through a large political campaign. Lincoln did fantastic. He can do even better moving forward if you sell our newspaper. And this was sent to Abraham Lincoln before it ever went anywhere else. They wanted to make sure that Lincoln was okay with it. So there's a copy of this at the Library of Congress, basically saying, this is what we want to say. We're calling us your newspaper. So I always say Selling Lincoln because they really were selling him. Here's the one at the Library of Congress. So it's basically a way of showing just how connected that they were. Now, this is a great newspaper as far as our history, because this is a newspaper from Abraham Lincoln basically renewing his newspaper subscription to the Chicago Tribune. So, and since the history of this place is the Tribune, it's a really great little letter. He basically says, I'll be subscribed to the Tribune until I can't afford it anymore. So it's a great little letter renewing his newspaper subscription. Okay, Lincoln is out there debating, and he basically starts sending letters to Abraham Lincoln. And there's a couple of really great quotes in here. But if you want to read it, you can. My favorite is the bottom one. Long story, he's in Cleveland, and he's like, if you're going to go and you're going to talk to people about yourself and your stance, he's like, I'm a Buckeye, I'm from Ohio, I know these people. And the bottom part of it, he sounds like a boxing coach. He's basically telling him, he's just like, roll like thunder, hit below the belt as well as above, kick like thunder. I mean, so he's basically suggesting ways where he can promote himself, promote his cause. The Chicago Tribune, another one. They switched from the Chicago Press and Tribune in early 1860, and now they're back to the Chicago Tribune again. The reason I bring it up is because earlier on we talked about their circulation. And their circulation, they had managed 5 years previously to hit 3,000 a day. At the very top of this, they're talking about asking their readers for their help, because they're almost at 15,000 a day and 40,000 on Sundays. This is huge for any newspaper at this period of time. That's why a lot of historians, when they talk about the Chicago Tribune during this period, say it was the most powerful Republican newspaper in the Midwest. It is based solely on circulation. Other historians have said, even though the circulation might have only been 15,000, there was many more people who would have read that, because one household would get it, their neighbors would read it. So this is how people would find out what Abraham Lincoln was saying. And the Chicago Tribune, by far, was supporting Lincoln during this period. Okay, great little letter from Dr. Charles Ray to Abraham Lincoln. The convention's upon us, and he basically says, hey, give us authority to make some wheeling and dealing deals for you. And he's just like, if you don't trust me, maybe you can trust this other person. For days before the convention, the Chicago Tribune editors and Lincoln's close friends were all connecting to various delegates to try to broker deals. And Lincoln heard about this and wrote a letter right back to David Davis or Norman Judge, one of the two. And he basically says, make no deals that bind me. He's like, stop it. I don't want this. Unfortunately, they did it anyway. So they made all these deals. And one of the deals, and I find it funny because the story is, during the convention, Medill was one of the heads of the Republican committee at the time, and he decides not to go sit with the Illinois folks, but he goes and sits with the Ohio folks. And he starts brokering a deal. He's like, hey, if you guys switch, I'll give Chase anything he wants. And they supposedly round 2, they're like, we switched to Lincoln. And then Lincoln got put over the top. He got the nomination. And, he ended up going on the cabinet. So did a bunch of other people where deals were brokered. So Chicago's got a bad reputation of making political deals. No difference in 1860. Same thing happened. Now, Lincoln is now the nominee. How does the Chicago Tribune help him? Besides saying nice positive things about him, they decide they're going to publish the first biography on Lincoln. So what they do is, this is a letter from John Locke Scripps, the man tasked with writing the biography on Lincoln, and they're writing it in various sections, and they're sending these letters to Abraham Lincoln to get his opinion on it. So this is a letter from Ray to Lincoln saying, hey, Medill's actually going to New York to make sure that we get this biography out about you. Do you have any suggestions or comments that we want to make in it? So this is them talking about the first biography on Abraham Lincoln, which was published by the Chicago Tribune. And I was really happy before I left working here, I talked him into buying one. So this is actually one of those early copies of the first biography on Abraham Lincoln. Now, because I'm limited in time, I don't want to get too far into the presidential election, because once Lincoln gets the nomination, while the Chicago Tribune becomes still as a constant supporter of Lincoln, other newspapers also pack up the cause, and tons of other newspapers start backing Lincoln, and the Chicago Tribune's role in supporting Lincoln just becomes one of many. Lincoln wins the election, and the rest is history, and that's why you're all here. But before I left, one of my favorite things is we mentioned Robert McCormick, Colonel McCormick, really loved his family's connection with Lincoln. One of the ways they did that is on various newspapers, they actually had these really cool paintings on display. This is a painting by James Sessions, and this shows Abraham Lincoln in 1858 when he would drop by the Chicago Tribune, and you got the young man standing up and the older man sitting down, and that's Ray. And he's on his way to New York. That's the moment they're capturing. They're on the way to New York for him to give the Cooper Union speech. Now, he's asking their notes. He's like, this is what I'm going to say. What do you think? And supposedly the story goes, they made all these notes. They spent hours making all these notes about what Lincoln should say and shouldn't say, gave him the notes back, and Lincoln went on his way. And then when they saw the Chicago Times copy of the Cooper Union speech, they're like, he didn't use anything. And the story, as Medill said, well, I guess all of his notes flew out the window. So while he would go to the Chicago Tribune and ask their advice, ask their opinions, because he would of any newspaper at the time, he didn't always use what they had to say. But this is the short version of how they helped him become president. There's a lot more to this, but I don't have time for that. But I hope you got a little out of it. Again, if you want to access any of these documents, let me know, and I can tell you where they're all at, because most of our Medill-related documents, which were here until a few years ago, found a new home at Northwestern University. So all of the documents are there. They're busy scanning them to make them for use for the public use. Luckily, when I had access to them, I scanned a bunch of them myself. But you can go there and see all of these yourself, or go to their websites. But I hope you enjoyed it. Does anybody have any questions? I have 2 questions. Your hand's up first. You get one. Okay. So the question is, so how can I say that the Chicago Tribune was the most influential newspaper in Abraham Lincoln's presidential election when other newspapers were also influential? Is that a nice summary? Okay. I say that because of the constant support of the Chicago Tribune. They didn't start later on. Most people jumped on Abraham Lincoln once he got the senatorial nomination, when he was nominated for that, or they jumped on board once he got the presidential election. I'm talking about the amount of support they gave him as early as 1856. They were constantly supporting Lincoln. It wasn't just articles periodically. They were also not just saying nice things about him or reporting things that they said. They're behind the scenes work. I mean, the reason the wigwam, the convention, was in Chicago was the Chicago Tribune. Joseph Medill was on the seating committee, who decided that they were going to stick all the pro-Douglas supporters off in the corner, blocked them with pro-Lincoln supporters, and then they put all the unknown Pennsylvania and all of the states on the other side so that they couldn't get back and forth and try to negotiate deals. There's all these behind-the-scenes works that the Chicago Tribune did by Joseph Medill and others. They also financially were supporting them in various ways as well, doing free pamphlets and things of that nature. No other newspaper was doing the amount of work that the Chicago Tribune was doing during that duration. I'm not trying to take away from other journals, because especially many of the ones you mentioned, vastly important. But I very clearly believe nobody did as much or as long as the Chicago Tribune did before his presidential election. You're welcome. One more. You have a question? Yes. The question is, did he buy a German newspaper? Yeah, and that's more recent knowledge. Like, he kept it quiet for a really long time. He bought the German newspaper. I don't know if it was that's. Mhm. Yeah, there's a lot of evidence showing that he did buy it. It was not something he made a lot of public knowledge about, but he did buy one. And just to show how important that was, the big thing about the Republican Party early on was that they were willing to take Germans. They were willing to take immigrants. They were willing to take these different individuals, where you had the big competitor was a Know-Nothing Party, who basically had a policy of, we're not taking Catholics, we're not taking immigrants, we're a good old boys club, and we're not really taking anybody else. And then you got the Republican, we'll take anybody who votes. So, I mean, there's a reason why the Germans, their newspapers would be very positive for Lincoln. So, thank you very much for coming. If you have any other questions, I'm at the Glen Ellen Historical Society because I have 2 graduations and a funeral to go to today, so I won't be here during the afternoon. But thank you very much for coming, and I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.